In the most isolated wing of the prison, the silence was broken only by the intermittent buzzing of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of the guard's footsteps. Elias Montero, lying on a narrow metal bed, kept his eyes fixed on the stained ceiling, as if searching for a piece of sky he would never see again. The execution was scheduled for 2 days from now, but the weight of time seemed irrelevant in the stillness in which he found himself. Nothing connected him to the outside world anymore, except for one vivid memory, persistent like the beating of a resilient heart. Spirit, the bay horse he had raised when he was just a boy in the countryside. Spirit was not just a memory. He was a refuge, a symbol of freedom, and the only image Elias could revisit without pain. He remembered the cold mornings in the fields, the rhythmic hooves on the damp earth, the sound of the wind slicing through the trails they rode. Amid an existence reduced to bars and concrete, that memory was what kept him whole. So, when asked about his last wish, Elias didn't hesitate. He asked to see the horse. An unusual request, regarded with some puzzlement by the prison bureaucracy, yet it was recorded and forwarded. As he waited for a response, he remained silent, not out of resignation, but because he had already said everything he needed to a world that never listened. In the upper floors, the prison warden examined the form with the final request. Used to petitions involving specific meals, books, or last visits, he found himself faced with something almost childish, a horse. For a moment, he felt the heartbeat of a time when men, even at the edge of death, could still have real bonds with something pure. But he soon returned to the rationality imposed by his role. Bringing an animal into the prison was a logistical, sanitary, and emotional challenge. Still, something about the request stirred him, and he decided to consult with his superiors. The call to the Department of Security revealed the absence of precedence, but also a small margin of discretion. Technicians weighed security, risks, and sanitary control. The response came with a maybe, a conditional one. The authorization would depend on the animal's origin, transport conditions, and the trustworthiness of the person bringing it. The warden took a deep breath and searched for the last known contact of someone who could find Spirit. There were no guarantees, only the faint possibility of granting a man, even one condemned, a final spark of humanity. While the bureaucrats decided the fate of his request, Elias remained immersed in the memory of Spirit. It was impossible to forget the day when, still a boy, he first saw the colt. His big, watchful eyes, his shiny coat, and the way he approached without fear, as if he already knew him. From then on, they became inseparable. They rode at dusk, crossing fields and streams, and the boy learned to listen to the world not through words, but through the rhythm of hooves and the wind brushing the animal's neck. The memories came in waves. The first fall, the scare, his father's laughter from afar. The sense of triumph when he managed to jump his first obstacle. The stormy days when Spirit neighed inside the barn and Elias stayed by his side, telling made-up stories. Those were the days when he still believed in justice, in kindness, in permanence. The image of Spirit was not just nostalgia. It was what remained of his identity before the world collapsed. Among the prison staff, Elias's request became a hallway topic. Comments emerged with stifled laughs and curious glances. A condemned man wanting to see a horse seemed like a misplaced fable. Some said it was a final whim of a defeated man. Others believed there was something noble in that silent wish. Yet even among the skeptics, it was impossible to ignore the subtle disturbance caused by that request, as if it exposed something everyone had learned to hide, the humanity behind the numbers and sentences. The warden, pressured by the execution deadlines and the need for a final opinion, managed to contact Miguel Duarte, a former employee of the ranch where Elias grew up. The old man's voice sounded hesitant on the phone, but still steady. He was still around, and so was Spirit. Not with the same strength as before, but alive, gentle, and seemingly waiting for something. When he hung up, the warden had an unsettling certainty. If the horse crossed the prison gates, something bigger than expected could happen. But maybe, he thought, that was exactly what the world needed, something improbable yet true. The wind blew gently through the low fields as Miguel Duarte brushed Spirit's aging coat, now showing white hairs around his eyes. The old horse kept a serene gaze, as if he still recognized the hands that had cared for him for so many years. Miguel, his face marked by wrinkles and his body bent by time, murmured thoughts as he ran the brush along the animal's ribs. Deep down, he felt that Spirit also carried Elias's absence, as if, even without understanding why, the horse knew that something precious had been taken from them. The warden's call had been unexpected, like a distant echo from a forgotten life. Upon hearing of Elias's request, Miguel felt a lump in his throat that prevented him from replying immediately. The boy he had watched grow up, the same one who spent hours with Spirit under the open sky, was now on the brink of death. And he wanted to see the horse. It seemed at once simple and immense. In Spirit's eyes, now silently watching him, Miguel felt the urgency of a reunion that could not be denied. As he prepared Spirit for the trip, Miguel found himself revisiting memories of Elias. He remembered the days when the boy would show up with a dirt-smeared face and eyes full of dreams. Always curious, always kind to animals, Elias had never raised his voice, not even in the face of the hardships of farm life. When the boy's father disappeared under mysterious circumstances, Miguel was the only adult who stayed close, trying to fill the void with stable routines and fireside stories. He had never believed the version that condemned Elias. That brutal crime in town, tied to a weak motive and flimsy evidence, never made sense to someone who truly knew the boy. For years, Miguel had tried to distance himself from the pain of seeing the kid taken away in handcuffs, treated like a monster by a hasty system. But now, with the request from the prison, he realized there was still something left to do. That journey, at that moment, was more than just taking a horse. It was perhaps the last chance to bring some truth to light. The next morning, before the sun even rose, Miguel put on his best linen shirt, polished his boots, and prepared the old trailer where Spirit would travel. The horse entered calmly, as if sensing that the journey had a purpose. The old truck creaked under the weight of the years, but Miguel was determined. The trip to the prison would require endurance, focus, and courage, but he carried with him more than an animal. He brought memories, loyalty, and perhaps a glimmer of justice. While adjusting the tarp and checking the required documents, an old envelope fell from a forgotten folder. Inside was a letter that had never been sent, written by Elias at the start of the trial. Miguel hesitated to read it, but eventually opened the yellowed paper. The words were filled with pain and gratitude, but there was a passage that stood out, a fragmented memory of the night of the crime, with details never mentioned in court. Something in that account made Miguel press the paper to his chest. There was more to that story than anyone knew. Before hitting the road, Miguel made a detour to a secluded house on the outskirts of a nearby village. There lived a man who, years ago, had worked with Elias's father in a little-known business. He was reserved, feared by many, and avoided any mention of the disappearance that preceded the collapse of the Montero family. When Miguel arrived, the man was not surprised, as if he had known this day would come. The conversation was brief, intense, and marked by silences heavier than words. What Miguel heard wasn't a confession, but it was enough to plant a deep doubt about everything said at the trial. The old worker left with no documents, no recordings, but with an unsettling certainty in his chest. The trip to the prison was no longer just a favor for a condemned man. It was part of a silent promise that, even if too late, the truth still deserved a chance. The timid morning light filtered through the opaque windows of the special visitation room. The floor was cold, the walls sterile, and the air carried the weight of all the farewells that had already taken place there. When the door opened and the sound of Spirit's hooves echoed down the corridor, Elias felt the air leave his lungs for a moment. Time seemed to freeze. Before him, the old horse appeared like an apparition, aged yet imposing, with eyes still alive, as if not a single year had passed since their last meeting. Elias approached slowly, every muscle in his body trembling. Spirit moved toward him immediately, without hesitation, as if recognizing in the scent and posture of the man the boy who once rode with him across the fields. When they finally touched, there was no sound but the slow breathing of both. It was a reunion without words, where only the warmth of hands and a muzzle resting on a chest said everything. Time, confinement, pain, for a moment all of it vanished. The contact with Spirit awakened more than tenderness. It brought back painful memories Elias had buried deep. On that terrible night, when everything changed, he was far from the crime scene, trying to save the small farm after his father's sudden disappearance. The police, under pressure from a high-profile case, rushed for quick answers. Elias, young, with no resources and a fragile family situation, became the perfect target. Everything was built on assumptions and flimsy evidence. As he stroked the horse's mane, flashes from that night returned like lightning bolts. The arrival of the police, his mother's screams, the sound of handcuffs. There was never any room for his voice. When he tried to explain where he had been and what he had done, his words were drowned out by the already crafted narrative. The image left for the world was that of a cold, silent young man, when in truth he was in shock, betrayed by the very system meant to protect him. Miguel, watching the reunion from a distance, finally approached with slow steps. In his hands, the yellowed envelope carried a weight beyond paper. He had decided to deliver it at that moment, when Elias's heart still beat strongly and his soul was open. Without a word, he extended the document. Elias received the letter with trembling hands, immediately recognizing the old handwriting, written in the first days after his arrest. As he reread his forgotten words, Elias found details he no longer remembered writing. There were mentions of a truck parked near the ranch road, of unfamiliar voices near the barn, and of a hooded figure leaving through the back. At the time, no one cared about this account. The court-appointed lawyer didn't even bring it to trial. But now, with everything Miguel had discovered, those details surged with renewed strength. It wasn't just memory. It was a clue. Miguel knelt beside Elias, as someone who shares a burden that should never have existed. He spoke carefully about the visit he had made before the trip. He told of the silent man who held secrets from the past, of the forgotten connection between Elias's father and influential figures in the region, and of how the official narrative always avoided certain names and places. Nothing was concrete proof yet, but the pieces were starting to shift in another direction. Elias listened in silence, his body still leaning against spirit. There was no anger in his eyes, only a heavy sadness, shaped by years of abandonment. But within that sadness, something new began to stir. Hope. For the first time in a long while, someone not only believed in him, but also brought possible paths forward. And it had all started there, with the improbable request to see a horse who had never forgotten him. In a small records room at the municipal registry office, Miguel and a young lawyer named Andre rummaged through dusty boxes. The light was dim, the smell of old paper filled the air, and the files were poorly organized, as if time and neglect had deliberately erased traces. They were searching for any documents linking Elias's family to land disputes or suspicious financial records, especially in the months leading up to the crime. After hours of combing through folders, a partially redacted old deed caught their attention, indicating a change of ownership of the Montero family land to a shell company. One of the intermediaries' names matched the man Miguel had visited before the trip. The connection seemed indirect, but the date coincided with Elias's father's disappearance. The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a dark outline around the former official narrative. Continuing the search, Andre found an unmarked envelope glued to the inside of a folder. Inside, it was an informal loan contract with abusive clauses and suspicious signatures. The lending company, now known to be fake, belonged to a group connected to local political figures. Elias, still a minor at the time, wasn't even mentioned as an heir, as if his existence had been strategically erased. The lawyer, experienced in land grabbing and corruption cases, recognized the concealment patterns. The contract, combined with the father's disappearance and the rapid sale of the property, painted a scenario where shady interests may have motivated the crime for which Elias was convicted. This didn't directly prove his innocence, but it completely undermined the prosecution's argument that no one else was involved. The foundation of the conviction was beginning to crack from within. With the new documents in hand, Andre decided to look for a former witness in the case, a man named Nestor, who had claimed at the time to have seen Elias near the crime scene. Now retired, Nestor lived in a peripheral neighborhood, away from the city. When the lawyer found him, the old man was hesitant, wary, but eventually allowed the conversation. They sat on a wooden porch, with birdsong occasionally breaking the tense silence. As Andre revealed the new discoveries, Nestor began to tremble slightly. Eventually, he admitted that, at the time, he had been pressured to confirm a story that had already been handed to him. He had never actually seen Elias that night. He had only heard rumors and repeated what others said he should have seen. His confession, though informal, reinforced the suspicion that the trial had been driven by a manufactured narrative. Meanwhile, at the prison, the warden received an urgent call. Miguel and Andre wanted to formally present the new evidence and request the immediate suspension of the execution procedure. It was a bold request, but the weight of the documents and Nestor's statement gave substance to their claim. Visibly shaken, the warden scheduled an emergency meeting with the public defender's office and representatives from the Department of Justice. Elias, still in the special cell, didn't know the details, but he sensed a change in the air. Guards moved more quickly, and their expressions were less cold. At that moment, time regained its weight, but now as a space of possibility. Something had been set in motion. And while Spirit rested outside, eyes half closed in the sun, the thread of hope that once seemed only symbolic began to turn into real momentum. In the administrative areas of the prison, the atmosphere was different. Phones rang non-stop, documents were copied in haste, and the warden paced back and forth carrying folders and reports. The public defender's legal team was mobilizing with rare urgency, knowing that only hours remained before the execution. The new documentation was being organized to send to the governor's office, hoping for a ruling that would halt the process. Meanwhile, Elias remained in his cell, hearing the sounds of mounting activity, but without knowing what they meant. The accumulated tension made time flow irregularly, at times too slow, at others in sudden leaps. Spirit, outside, had been placed in a secure area, but the thought that their encounter might have been the last consumed Elias's every thought. The man stood at the edge of the abyss, clinging to a thread of revelations that might have come too late. Across town, the prosecution had been urgently summoned to review the documents submitted by the defense. The original prosecutor was not present, replaced by an assistant less involved with the case's history. With each new paper reviewed, the room fell deeper into silence. The links to the shell company, the witness's admission, and the omitted records painted a picture full of doubt. The public defenders insisted that, even without conclusive proof of Elias's innocence, there was clear evidence that the process had been compromised. Their argument was simple and forceful. As long as there is reasonable doubt, the execution would be irreversible and unacceptable. The pressure mounted, and the prosecution began to retreat, recognizing that at the very least, more time was needed to examine the new facts. Back at the prison, the warden faced his hardest dilemma. Legally, there was still no formal suspension order. But morally, the signs could no longer be ignored. Protocol dictated that preparations for the execution continue, including final cell arrangements and medical procedures. He looked at the clock, then at the freshly printed report titled Urgent Suspension Request, still without an official stamp. In his office, with semi-open windows letting in the dry evening air, the warden contemplated a framed photo of his daughter on the desk. He remembered when Elias first arrived at the prison, a quiet young man with a clear gaze who never got into trouble, even among the worst. Deep down, he wished the final decision would come from above, so he wouldn't have to bear alone the weight of choosing between duty and conscience. Then, minutes before the time scheduled for Elias's transfer to the execution chamber, a call came through. It was from the governor's office. The order was clear. Temporary suspension granted for 48 hours, enough time to investigate the new evidence and call a judicial review. The warden didn't reply immediately. He simply closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, as if he had been holding his breath for years. In the cell, Elias heard footsteps approaching. But this time, the key wasn't to take him to his death. The guard looked at him with tearful eyes and simply said he had 2 more days. Elias, in silence, leaned against the wall, trying to steady the trembling in his body. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't justice yet. But it was life. And, in that moment, it was all he could wish for. 2 days after the execution was suspended, the tension in the prison gave way to a quiet sense of expectation. The extraordinary hearing was held behind closed doors, with the presence of new attorneys, public defenders, and members of the governor's office. The evidence gathered in recent days, now properly formalized, dismantled the foundation of the original conviction. As a result, a release order was urgently issued, along with a request for a full review of the case. When the cell door opened for the last time, Elias didn't stand up right away. He needed a few seconds to understand it was real, that the years of waiting, pain, and isolation had finally found a different outcome. The guard who had always treated him coldly handed him the release papers with trembling hands. As he crossed the prison gates, Elias felt the fresh air as if breathing for the first time. Outside, under the warm light of the afternoon sun, Spirit awaited him alongside Miguel. The trip back was silent, interrupted only by the steady sound of tires on the road and the occasional neighing of Spirit. Miguel drove with his eyes fixed on the road, but with a soul at peace. Elias, sitting beside him, looked at the familiar landscapes with teary eyes. Every curve, every tree, every fence, all seemed part of a world that had been stolen from him, but that somehow still remembered him. When they arrived at the old ranch, Elias stepped out of the car without haste. The place was aged, but alive. The barn still stood, the corral overgrown with weeds, and the house with peeling paint. All bore the marks of time, but also of waiting. Spirit was released, and, as if guided by memories, galloped through the field with a lightness Elias never imagined he'd witness again. There, at the center of that setting, Elias felt something move inside him, a freedom that went beyond walls, something that was beginning to heal. Later, under the orange twilight sky, Elias walked slowly across the field where he used to practice jumps with Spirit. His steps were unsure but steady, like someone relearning how to walk on their own ground. Miguel watched silently from afar. On the porch, a small suitcase awaited with clean clothes and a handwritten letter, a message of welcome and hope. As he entered the house, Elias was enveloped by the scent of old wood and the memories it held. He touched the furniture, walked past the pictures, recognized the marks on the doors. He felt like a stranger in his own story, but also a survivor. Wrapped in a blanket, he sat on the living room floor, closed his eyes, and allowed himself to cry. Not for the pain he endured, but for the chance to finally go on. The next morning, before the sun rose, Elias got up. Dew covered the grass and the cold still bit at the skin, but there was purpose in his movements. He walked to the stable, carefully prepared the saddle, and called for Spirit, who came to him calmly. Without hurry, he mounted the horse, once again feeling the old weight of the saddle against his legs and the familiar rhythm of the animal's gait. The first gallop was restrained, like a reunion between two bodies that needed to rediscover one another. But as they crossed the open field, the speed picked up, the wind cut across Elias's face, and the sound of the hooves echoed like a forgotten song. There were no bars, no voices, no condemnations. Just the man and his horse, slicing through the field like two survivors who, despite everything, still believed in the power of returning. It was the gallop of freedom, and it would echo for a long time in the hearts of those brave enough to listen. Tell me in the comments what your rating from 0 to 10 would be for the story, and we'll see each other in the next video that's on the screen.